7:35 through 37. Now again, this whole chapter is Stephen's speech, pretty much. The story of Stephen. He's still talking about Moses. And God sent back the same man his people had previously rejected by demanding, "Who made you ruler and judge over us?" Moses was sent to be their ruler and savior. So it's interesting. Who sent him to be judge was the question they asked him later. Nobody sent him to be judge at that point in time. Nobody sent him to be a leader for them at that time. But later God would. And even though we see in the Old Testament, and it ain't brought up here, how they questioned his leadership and how many people even rebelled against his leadership, God was still behind him as leader because he's truly called to be a leader. We see earlier how he ends up telling the people what they need to do, but God ain't there. So his leadership falls, and what attempt he makes at being a leader there falls, and he leaves the wilderness. And by means of many remarkable miracles, he led them out of Egypt and through the Red Sea and back and forth through the wilderness for 40 years. So this ain't just referring to the plagues, it's referring to anything. Him dropping the staff and it becoming a snake. All this is what it's referring to. Everything that was miraculous. Now, the miracles were to show that Moses was led by God. Similar thing was done with the apostles. Miracles were done to show they were of God and represented God. Because prior to the word being given, similar with Moses, the word hadn't been given yet because Moses was the one who wrote it down. The miracles showed who he served. The Gospels, before they were written, the apostles were doing miracles to show who they served. We also know in time how humbleness is often characterized, because Moses never took credit for the miracles he did. The apostles, true apostles, never took credit for that he did. So who gets the credit is one of the things we know to see whether they're of God or not. If they're boasting about what they do and what they did, it's of them. So, while Moses actually sometimes gets the credit for all these parting the Red Sea, Moses never parted the Red Sea. As God parted the Red Sea, Moses was just the leader and led them through it. So it ain't mentioned here again, but the reason why they had to wander 40 years through the wilderness was because of the lack of their own faith. They didn't have enough faith for God to take them through to the promised land. So they had to wander. Moses himself told the people of Israel, "God will raise up a prophet much like me from among your brothers." Now, this prophecy in general refers to all the prophets that would be after Moses, because traditionally by the Pharisees, Moses was considered the highest of the prophets, the most important of the prophets. They had their books were lined up, the law, which was Moses' books. They considered him the greatest prophet. And then the prophets, this is why we see scriptures oftentimes in the New Testament referred to as the law and the prophets, which is a lot of the Old Testament. And then the historical, then the writings, which include stuff as Psalms and Job and Daniel and this similar things of that nature. Ezra and Nehemiah, Esther and Ruth. These were in the writings, and the Pharisees may have not been genuinely accepted, the writings, by everybody universally at that time, but the law and prophets were, and the law and prophets were recognized as high. So the fact that it's a general reference to anybody who God called after him, which we see Samuel, we see Joshua, we see all these other men. But it was also a significant reference to the Messiah. And this is the way the Pharisees understood it. The prophet that Moses spoke about was not fulfilled by Isaiah. It wasn't fulfilled by Jeremiah or any of these. It would be the Messiah. So for Stephen to bring this up is for them to know, okay, he's talking about the Messiah. He ain't talking about a prophet. He's talking about the Messiah. So they would have known. It's also one reason why the prophet here is capitalized in my Bible. Probably y'all's too. How true this proved to be, for in the wilderness Moses was the go-between mediator between the people of Israel and the angel who gave them the law of God, the living word on Mount Sinai. So we see this as oftentimes what the prophet does. We see how they represent before God, the people. We see how Abraham, in fact, did this with Sodom and Gomorrah. How he was between and he represented the people before God. We see how this is done in the Old Testament, how they counsel, how Moses did this. We see how at one point God's willing to abandon the people, and Moses takes up for them and says, well, just be patient with them. And we see how prophets do this. And more importantly, we know as Christians, we know how Jesus did this. He stood in, he became a mediator. It's interesting because in the book of Job, which is considered by Jewish writings, so that not all of them would have known that story, but Job prayed for a mediator because he knew questioning God wasn't something he could do himself. Today as Christians, we have a mediator. It's Christ.